back with us Professor Steve Taylor from Liverpool University. Steve has already spoken a number of times for us on dinosaurs and dragons, on climate change. And if you're interested in hearing more about those talks, you can go to our video section on the Facebook channel or to YouTube, and you will find those talks. They're really great talks that Steve has done for us. But tonight we're going to look at a very intriguing question: accident or design? How did we get here? There are only two explanations for this really in the world: either creation, God created, or life evolved. And Steve is going to present to us tonight the argument for why we are created, why we're created by the God of Scripture. So I'm not going to waste any more time. I'm going to thank Steve for being here and just hand over to you, Steve. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Simon. Thanks, folks, for checking in tonight on this important subject of accident or design. How did we get here? Everybody asks this question. And of course, it's important for Christians to be able to give the answer from the Bible and the evidence for the reason for that hope that is within us. So that's our subject this evening: accident or design. This talk is in two parts. We're looking at the big picture in the first part, and then if you want to stay tuned for another part later in the series, we'll be looking at part two, if you like, zooming down the electron microscope at the very, very small. The world of nanotechnology also shouts design. So let's now go in, if we can. Let me introduce our subject. It's always good to start with a definition of terms. What do we mean? And so what do we mean by design in the context of how did we get here? Well, effectively, we mean creation. What do we mean by accident in the context of how we got here? Well, effectively, we mean some sort of evolutionary explanation, a naturalistic, without God explanation. So we're going to define terms, and then we're going to look at the evidence and the problems. In particular, the problems that you will seldom hear in the secular educational system, the genuine problems that there are with the theory of evolution, and of course, the evidence, the positive evidence that there is for design. It's not difficult to find it. Does it really matter? Is this just a discussion between different philosophies, different worldviews, different points of view, or does it really make a difference day to day on planet Earth in the 21st century? I'm going to suggest it makes a big difference. And of course, some folks are synthesists. What's a synthesist? Well, he takes the thesis and the antithesis, and he makes a synthesis. Design and accident, creation and evolution. Does that really work as an explanation? We're going to look at the reasons, the thinking, and the reasons why it doesn't work a little bit later. And then I'm going to draw some conclusions and give you the ultimate proof for design. The ultimate proof is coming up later in the talk. So, definition of terms, you can do no better as a definition of design or creation than the very, very first verse on the first page of every Bible. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Only 7 words in the original Hebrew, and yet words which are amazing in their simplicity and in their profundity and in their all-embracing reach. Once there was nothing at all but God, but then the eternal God at a moment created time and space, matter and energy. He brought it all into being by his own powerful word. We have the creation event that took 6 days. Over the first 6 days of the history of the universe, an all-powerful God created everything that we can see and everything that we can't see by his own power. God created the heavens and the earth. Well, that's a design. That's a definition of creation or design. We could go, there are other definitions, of course, but the point is this: design is the product of an intelligent being. Design implies thought and personality. And that's why we're introduced to God, who is a spirit, who is a personal, infinite creator God, a triune God, tri-personal, three persons in one God. That's the amazing God of the Bible that we find presented to us in this very first verse, because of course God is a plural word, created is a singular verb. Design. Okay, let's look at the idea of evolution. This is a simplified family tree for mankind. It gets a lot more complicated, but basically this family tree that you see shown here from a children's textbook is what is taught in schools and universities the world over, that all of life is connected, a part of the so-called tree of life, and descended from a common ancestor, which also had a naturalistic explanation some billions of years ago, so that we're in the same family as an orangutan, as the insects, as even the bananas and the vegetables on the left-hand side, as well as the fish, the amphibians, and so on. We're all connected. The definition from we've had a Bible definition. Let's have an evolutionary definition from the Collins Dictionary. Evolution is the origination of species by development from earlier (simpler) forms of life over millions of years by the processes of natural selection and or mutation. We're going to look at those three questions, millions of years, natural selection, and mutation, briefly in this talk. But effectively, the scenario here is a chance scenario. Mutation is a chance or a random process. And of course, if something has a random element in its series, in its occurrence, it also becomes a random process. And effectively here, there's no intelligence behind this. This is just naturalistic processes. Time, chance, and nature are said to produce all that we see. God is excluded on this basis. And the question is, which is true? Which do you believe? Which is more reasonable? Which fits the science better? That's what we're thinking of tonight. This is a little bit more complicated family tree. That one's taken from the UK Open University website. You can see it's got a lot more creatures on there, but it's effectively the same thing. You start with a universal common ancestor here, and everything, whether it's the fish and the amphibians, whether it's the land animals, mammals, the insects, or the dinosaurs are in there. And of course, right at the top or near the top, you've got man. And there's the evolutionary tree of life, which is the taken from the Open University website. Now, the thing that you're not taught generally in the secular schools would be the huge problems with this explanation of life. The first thing to say, of course, that it's not proven. You cannot prove this tree, not in the sense of doing any experiments to show how one major group of animals has been able to change over the generations to another major group of animals. People will say, well, there's not enough time to see this experimentally. Okay, let's admit that. But what about those experiments where people have tried mutations on fruit flies or have observed bacteria for many, many generations, things which you can have multiple generations? Again, evolution is not demonstrable in the laboratory by these means. And I think the challenge is to the evolutionist to say, well, look, folks, if this is true, can you prove it with an experiment that can be reproduced, that all can see? People have done lots of experiments to try and prove evolution by mutation, followed by natural selection. But they've only succeeded for the very vast majority of making the organism worse, deleterious, or harmful or lethal mutations, or in fact in causing retrograde steps as a result of the process. And we'll come on to that a little bit later. So the challenge for the evolutionist to prove his thesis. People cite fossil evidence as evidence for the tree of life, but actually the overwhelming picture from the fossils is that the transitional forms, which should be throughout the tree, the branches, are missing. And that is widely acknowledged to be the case, even after decades and decades of paleontological research. The candidates for the missing links are very few, and such as they are, they're all found to be wanting. There is massive missing evidence. If this tree were true, we'd expect to find hundreds of missing links, but in fact, the fossil evidence is still missing. It is sad to say, and again, it's admitted by all, that some of the past evidence that's been cited in favor of evolution has in fact been mistaken, or it's been fraudulent. And of course, the fakes, the evolutionary fakes, are notorious. We'll look at one or two of those in a minute. Even if we allow the evolutionist cut him some slack, as it were, there's still the huge question of mechanism. So how did something like an eye, which is hardwired to the brain with its 23 trillion cells to interpret the image amongst many other functions it carries out, how did something like that evolve? The challenge of organs of extreme complexity. Darwin was aware of it. And of course, he gives his explanation, which was limited by his 19th century knowledge. Since then, our knowledge has increased dramatically, and the problems of mechanism, how something as complex as the eye or the liver or the heart or the brain or the ear, how these can form by naturalistic means is completely, at the moment, beyond scientific or naturalistic explanation. But you know, the real weakness of the tree, we've spoken of the weaknesses of the branches being missing, of the mechanisms for different organs of complexity, of the fake evidence, fake news in the past, and of the fossil evidence that's missing in the present. But the real weakness, you know, is right at the bottom of the tree here, the root. You see, no one has got any idea of how life could have formed in a naturalistic scenario where natural selection and mutation just do not work on dead chemicals. So how you get from dead chemicals to living cells is the huge missing link, the huge unanswered question in the tree of life. It's called abiogenesis. Of course, evolutionists will admit it's a problem, but they will express with a certain amount of blind faith here that science will tell us the answer one day. Science has got no ideas and no convincing explanation for how we get life from non-life. And it's a faith position that they hold, in fact, to explain or to postulate that affirmation. Life from non-life, then, the great weak spot. The tree, then, without branches and without a root, it's got a problem. That's the tree of life, according to the evolutionist. Let's think about experimental proof. Newton's prism, you might have done this at school. You might have read about it, how Isaac Newton proved that the white light was formed of the seven colors of the rainbow. And of course, he was able to demonstrate it demonstrable in every science lab. You don't even have to be in a science lab. You can be in a darkened room with a piece of glass and crack the curtains, and you can do this for yourself. Observation, experiment. We know it's right. It's called the scientific method. And of course, Darwin was honest enough to admit in his Life and Letters, not one change of species into another is on record. We cannot prove, by which he meant experimentally, that a single species has been changed. Darwin's words, he's honest enough to accept the problem. 160 years later, we're still in the same position, that there's no hard experimental evidence for evolution, large scale macroevolution. And if you dispute that, please Well, bring it on. Let's have a look at it. The lack of fossil evidence is famous and accepted. Darwin's, again, said in his chapter 6, Difficulties of the Theory, if species have descended from species by fine gradations, why do we not see everywhere innumerable transitional forms? This perhaps is the most serious objection to my theory. Well, it's good to see him acknowledging that. Oh, that some of our more modern day evolutionists would be so candid about the difficulties. The family trees which adorn our textbooks are based on inference, however reasonable, not the evidence of fossils. Now look at the dates here. This is Darwin in 1859 in The Origin, and this is Jay Gould, Harvard paleontologist, in Natural History in 1977. So here we are, we're almost 120 years on, and the fossil evidence is still missing. The serious objection to Darwin's theory is still in place 120 years on, according to Jay Gould. Let me give you another quotation, this time from Dr. Colin Patterson. He was asked about this in the 70s. And of course, he replied, which he admits to saying, or he admitted to it, that he applied this. Gould and the American Museum people are hard to contradict when they say there are no transitional fossils. I will lay it on the line. There is not one such fossil for which we could make a watertight argument. Amazing statement from Patterson, senior paleontologist at the British Museum, FRS, seriously well-qualified scientist here. He does go on, it must be said, to maintain his faith in evolution. But I'd like to point out that it's a faith that's maintained in spite of this admission, not because there's suddenly transitional fossils that have come to life that prove his point. He believes in evolution in spite of the lack of the fossil evidence. There are, of course, fraudulent examples. 1999, with the arms of a primitive bird and the tail of a dinosaur, this creature is a true missing link, transitional form, in the complex chain that connects dinosaurs to birds. Well, there's lots of assertions there that we'd love to take hold of if we had time, and that was published in National Geographic in 1999. But of course, in the same magazine, a year or so later, 2000, Archaeoptera revealed was a fraud, a forgery concocted by a Chinese farmer for profit. So it's full marks to National Geographic for highlighting to their readers the fraudulent nature of the evidence. But of course, from 1999 until it was published in 2000, everyone would have read the first statement and of course would have believed, oh, we have a true missing link, which of course was found to be fraudulent. There's more famous ones than that, of course. In 1912, the skull and the jawbone were found, a skull and jawbone were found in a gravel pit in Piltdown in Sussex in England. Experts were convinced that the missing link had been found. Here's the members of the Geologists Association visiting the Piltdown site, including some of the world's best paleontological experts in Britain anyway. The Piltdown skull on the inset on the bottom right there was found to be a hoax eventually. What did they find? In 1953, so this is 41 years later, the Piltdown skull was fluorine dated. The upper part of it, the cranium, was found to be human, and the lower jaw was found to be that of an orangutan, with the teeth filed down to make it look human. Would you believe it? Would you believe it that someone had taken these two fossils, knowing that one was an orangutan, knowing that one was a human skull cap, plaster of Paris them together, filed the teeth down, hidden it in the soil, and then walked away in order that people would believe in human evolution? And of course, by 1953, hundreds of articles Dozens of PhD theses had been written, all on this false, totally false and fraudulent premise that man had evolved through ape-like stages to be. Piltdown man was the missing link between the apes and the humans. It is shocking, isn't it, when people have to resort to fraud in order to bolster the theory. As one man said, if the evidence is there, why do people need to fake it? If the evidence is there, why did they need to fake it? And once the fake is out, why didn't someone come forward and say, actually, you shouldn't believe this lie, I did it? Well, maybe there's other reasons we can speculate, but someone did it. And of course, that person has never owned up. Well, to think about the mechanisms here, again, I'm going to quote from Origin. To suppose that the eye, with all its inimitable contrivances for adjusting the focus to different distances, for admitting different amounts of light, could have been formed by natural selection, seems, I freely confess, absurd in the highest degree. Now that's a quotation taken from the Origin of the Species, chapter 6, Organs of Extreme Perfection. It's fair to say that Darwin goes on to argue how this could have happened, but he is honest enough to admit the difficulties. He maintains his faith, however, in evolution, in spite of those difficulties. But you see, since Darwin, the explanation of the origin of the eye by natural selection and mutation has become even more challenging. Why? Because the eye is no use without a vision system to interpret the image. We now know a lot more about image processing, processing of images, whether they're X-ray or MRI scans or whatever. You need a vision system and you need an interpretive mechanism to make sense. So you cannot speak of the eye, even though that's complex enough, as Darwin was doing here. You have to speak about the brain, because the eye is hardwired to the interpretive system, which is the brain here. So it becomes an orders of magnitude more difficult to suppose that the eye and the brain evolved by natural selection. It's absurd, I would say, in the highest degree. And then we've got the difficulty of life from non-life. Everyone has grown from a single cell. This was once you, as it was once me. But each cell, of course, contains more atoms than there are stars in the Milky Way. And there's no such thing as a simple cell. Darwin, with his 19th century knowledge, and I'm not knocking that, I'm just saying it's a fact that he did not and he could not, as no scientist in those days could have known, the staggering world, nanotechnological world of the cell with its micro machines, its molecular machines, like a huge, someone has compared it to a huge factory or a huge spaceship with different functional proteins coming here and there, carried about by miniature machines like robots. It is a staggering world, the world of the cell. It's far from simple. Michael Denton, who is a molecular biologist, in 1986 wrote the book Evolution, a Theory in Crisis. He was considering the design the design of the cell. And he said this, is it really credible? Can we really believe this? That random processes could have constructed a reality, the smallest element of which is complex beyond our own creative capacities, which excels in every sense anything produced by the intelligence of man. Now think about what he's saying here. He's asking, is it really believable that a cell like this, with all the complexity it has, we cannot make, we can't create them, it's beyond our intelligence to understand it, let alone make it. Is it really credible? Can we really believe that it came by a random process, undesigned, unplanned, uncaused? He says no. And he's right. Life is too complex to have arisen by chance. We've spoken about the hardware of life as we've looked at the cell. What about the software of life? You see, although DNA is coded on the molecules of A, C, G, and T, we find that the message that's coded there is in fact not a property of the molecules, but a property of their arrangement. What do I mean? Well, when you have letters on a page, let's take the word L-I-F-E, you've got 4 letters there, but they can be combined in many different ways. And of course, it's only when you have the word L-I-F-E that we get the idea, life. The arrangement of the letters contains the information that we want to convey. The information is not conveyed by the molecules of the ink that are on the letters, because you can have the same ink in the same amount, but if the arrangement is wrong, you won't get the message. Similarly with DNA, except this. It's three-dimensional, and it's the information medium with, as far as we know, the highest known storage density. I've got an iPhone in my pocket here. I don't know if I'm allowed to do that. Any adverts? I'm not trying to advertise for Apple, but you have the hardware, but you have the software that goes in that programs the device. And of course, you have the hardware of life, our bodies, but what programs them to function, and the non-material part is in the DNA. And of course, how can software be produced by chance? We do not, it can't be produced by chance. We don't believe it's produced by chance. Whenever we see a software program, we know that there is a software engineer, software designer. Fred Hoyle was a Nobel Prize winner. And of course, he was an astronomer. He knew this, that the chance of the assembly of one of the biopolymers on which life depends was mathematically impossible. He expressed it this way. Imagine 10 to the power 50. How many is that? Imagine the solar system end to end with blind men, each with a scrambled Rubik's cube. Try to conceive of them all simultaneously arriving at the solved form. You then have the chance of arriving by random shuffling, random variation of just one of the many biopolymers on which life depends. It's nonsense, said Hoyle, and nonsense of a high order. Of course, it didn't lead him to the God of the Bible. It led him to postulate the idea that there's some aliens out there which have seeded life on planet Earth. But of course, that just pushes the question back to the aliens. Okay, so who made these smart aliens then? If they're smart enough to make life, they must be smart indeed. Who made them? And of course, we just keep going back, don't we, with that sort of faulty reasoning. Whenever we find information, it implies intelligence. The SETI project works on that basis, search for extraterrestrial intelligence. A simple message from the stars with a radio telescope would be considered proof of intelligence. 2, 2, and a 4 in a non-random sequence would be indicative, people believe, of an intelligent source. Now, come with me here. If a simple message of a few bits or tens of bits would be proof of intelligence, why cannot those same scientists take, by the same reasoning, the DNA with its 4 billion bits of information cannot be a product of chance? It's proof supreme of intelligence. You cannot get large amounts of coded information produced by random processes. It just doesn't happen. So DNA is evidence of intelligence. It's evidence of design. It's evidence of a mind. And of course, it's evidence of God. There's the DNA molecule. Thinking a little bit more about the theory of evolution, one of the prize horses in the stable is said to be the peppered moth story. Professor Michael Majerus from Cambridge said this, it's one of the best examples of evolution in action. And of course, the story is that peppered moths are the black and the white are the same species. Both were in existence before 1800, before the Industrial Revolution. Both are still in existence today, but their frequencies, their observed frequencies of the commonness of each of these types of moth have varied according to the conditions, the atmospheric and the environmental conditions. So during the Industrial Revolution, it was measured that it was known that the black moths proliferated and the population of black moths became greater because, of course, the trees where the moths land were said to be darkened by the soot from the factories and the chimneys, which provided better camouflage against predators, birds, and the birds ate all the white moths. And of course, when we got our act together and we cleaned up the air and the Clean Air Act, and we managed to reduce the amount of pollution going into the environment, the black moths became easier to spot by their predators, the birds, and they ate those, and the white moths made a comeback. And of course, I think 2018, the populations of each are around about the same as what they were before the Industrial Revolution. So this is said to be an example of evolution. It's certainly an example of changing gene frequencies in response to environmental pressures. But is that really enough to get us from molecules at the bottom of the evolutionary tree to man with a 23 trillion cell brain at the top? No, it isn't. What you've got here is moths at the start, moths in the middle, and moths at the end. Where is the evolution in all of this? You've got, and as I say, a variation in gene frequency according to environmental pressures, period. You've got no example, no experimental example of one type of animal, one kind of animal changing or becoming into another type of animal. Moths not changing into anything, and both, of course, were there before the selection pressures began. Stay with me a little longer on this one. Imagine if we hadn't have had the Clean Air Act and all of the white moths had been deleted, eaten, destroyed from the population, and there were only black moths left. So in that case, we would have started with two types and ended up with one. That's not evolution, is it? That's natural selection producing extinction of a less fit, but it's not producing the arrival of a more fit because he was already here in the population before the process began. Check it out, friends. You've got here what's said to be one of the best examples of evolution in action, but where actually is the large-scale evolution that's needed by the evolutionary family tree? Let's look at the evidence, shall we, for creation. Wherever you look in nature, you find design, whether it's in the atmosphere we breathe, the trees that we enjoy, the water that we drink, or the food that we eat. Design is everywhere. You have the evidence of creation, I'm going to put it this way, supremely in the Bible, because the Bible claims to be the book that is the word of the Creator. But the ultimate proof is that the Creator of all things entered the creation, that God became man. Let me think about design for a minute. We all know that a watch must have had a maker. And even if you've never seen a watch made, it's true that a watch had a maker. Even if the watch isn't working properly, you still know it must have had a maker. Even if you don't understand how it all works, you still know it's had a maker. And someone would be very surprised to be told that the watch was nothing more than the results of metallic nature. You wouldn't believe them. And if someone said, well, there's no plan here in this watch, you wouldn't believe it. But of course, your mind your hand, your eye, far more complex than a watch. Design is self-evident from the world around us. The Bible claims to be inspired, that is to say, it's the word that's been breathed out by God. It is found to be self-consistent. It doesn't contradict itself anywhere. It has a single message, even though written by many different authors over a 1500-year period. It has been found to be accurate historically, archaeologically, again and again, and also scientifically. When it touches upon science, it's not written as a scientific textbook. Our scientific textbooks today, by the way, will be poo-pooed, laughed at, perhaps 100 years from now if we're still here. The Bible is not written in that way as a scientific textbook, but wherever it touches upon science, it's found to be accurate. It's inerrant. There are no facts of history or archaeology or science, proven facts, demonstrable, which can be shown to go against it. It's been fulfilled prophetically again and again. And of course, it's very clear when it comes to design. In 6 days, the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that in them is, and rested on the seventh day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. That's the biblical position. That's the biblical doctrine here of design, if you like, or creation of everything by God. Did you remember in the introduction, I mentioned the third possibility? We've thought about evolution, why it doesn't work, creation, why it does work. What about those who say, well, maybe God used evolution? Okay, you convinced me there must be a God, but perhaps he used the theory of evolution. Well, there is a problem with that from a biblical or a Christian point of view. You see, what we find is a geological column which shows a thin layer of sedimentary rock, that's rock that's been laid down by water, all over the earth, full of all different types of fossils, of all different types of creatures, sometimes with marine creatures alongside dinosaurs and other creatures which were supposed to have been extinct at the same time as creatures which were not known to be extinct until so-called millions of years later. You find a complete fossil record around the world. And if, of course, that God used evolution, then it implies that there were millions of years of disease, because we find disease in the fossil record, suffering, because we find cancers in the fossil record, and death. And death, of course, of everything in a fossil record is dead. So you've got millions of years of disease, death, and suffering before we come to the good creation that God describes in the Bible. Does that fit? Well, of course, it doesn't fit. It undoes the message of the gospel, actually. And the Apostle Paul says so. Wherefore, as by one man sin entered the world, and death by sin, and so death passed upon all men, for that all have sinned. The New Testament teaching given here by the Apostle Paul, but also in the Gospels and in other apostles, is against the idea of millions of years of death and suffering before we get to man. The picture is the reverse. God started, it was very good, but it went downhill, and suffering and disease and death came after man had messed up by rebelling against his creator. Evolution says matter plus time plus nothing else equals everything that we see. And the creation evolutionist, the theistic evolutionist, says matter plus time plus God gives us everything that we see. And of course, in those two equations, you don't have to be a mathematician to read that according to the theistic evolution interpretation, God is the same as nothing. And that's a devastating critique of that position. It doesn't work. It doesn't need to be that way. Jesus taught, have you not read in the beginning which he made them male? Have you read that he which made them at the beginning made them male and female. Jesus spoke of the beginning, a reference to Genesis, which he believed, not a millions of years scenario of man after millions of years after the beginning. Jesus believed Genesis, that's true, and all the way through, he used it, he cited it, he quoted it, he preached from it, and he taught from it. If Jesus believed in Genesis as it's written, then those who claim to be the followers of Jesus should believe in Genesis too, in the way that their master believed it. You know, we come to the conclusion of this talk and we ask ourselves the question, does it really matter? You know, this year in the UK, we remembered 50 years of the Holocaust. It's more, isn't it? It's 70 years of the Holocaust since 1940, of course, and we've got the beliefs about origins influence behavior at some future period, not very far distant, as measured by centuries. The civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace throughout the world the savage races. That was written by Hitler in written by Darwin in his Descent of Man in 1871, but it was taken up by Hitler in his Mein Kampf, written in the 30s. The Nazis appealed to evolution to justify the Holocaust. One of the men who was a famous evolutionist and brilliant anatomist in our own country was an evolutionist, and he was honest enough to admit the German Führer is an evolutionist. He has consciously sought to make the practice of Germany conform to the theory of evolution, and the Holocaust against the Jews and others perpetrated in the last war, the Second World War, was evidence of the failure, the importance of this idea, and its complete and utter failure. Of course, abortions in the UK are at the horrific level of 200,000 per year. Many of those, of course, are for so-called trivial reasons, clear cases of a callous disregard for human life, which does form at conception. Let there be truth is the Answers in Genesis cartoon here. A man walks into an art gallery and sees the Mona Lisa and realizes it's from the hands of a genius. He goes into the next room and he sees a beautiful sculptor and he says it's brilliant, a work of art, such plan and purpose. But then he looks at a picture of a baby in the womb. And of course, he says, just the product of natural processes. There's no creator. We can get rid of that anytime we want to. Why do so many believe in evolution? Well, it's fair to say that not all scientists do accept it. The great founders of the profession that I work in, Faraday, Maxwell, and Fleming, were all Bible-believing Christians. In 6 Days is a book in which 50 practicing scientists who believe in Genesis say why. And of course, on the website of Descent from Darwin, please type that in and Google that, Descent from Darwin, there's over 1,000 signatories, or practicing signatories, who are skeptical, or go on record as saying they're skeptical of Darwinian evolution being a fact. Many have never considered the scientific evidence, of course, because it's not widely trailed on the media, and some are very prejudiced against any non-naturalistic explanation. Look what Richard Lewontin says here. No matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying, we accept evolution, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. Can you see what he's saying here? Whatever the evidence, my mind is made up, and it's not going to allow God into the picture. That is a completely prejudiced position. The ultimate proof is this. Jesus Christ claimed to be God, the Creator. He said, I and my Father are one. They asked him, are you the Son of God? He said he was. And on that basis, he was condemned to death for blasphemy, because he, a man, had made himself God. Now, he claimed to be God. Was he mad? Was he telling us lies? Was he bad? Or is he in fact God? C.S. Lewis put this trilemma some decades ago, and of course it's true today. Either Jesus is mad, he's deluded, or he's wicked, he's telling us lies, making himself out to be someone that he knows he's not, or in fact, he's being honest with us and he is saying he's God because actually he is God. And of course he does, and he says the things that only God can say. He did the things that only God can do. He was able to create. This was witnessed by thousands of people on more than one occasion. He was able to control the winds and the waves. He was able to heal deaf, dumb, blind, and dead. He was able to give life to people dead for days, done in the presence of multiple witnesses on more than one occasion in more than one place. These were miracles, friends, which couldn't be faked. There were just too many witnesses. And of course, his disciples and others lived and died on the basis of what they had heard and seen. The greatest miracle of all, of perhaps, is this: he died and rose again from the dead 3 days later. To anyone who's never considered the evidence for the resurrection, can I challenge any atheist who may be listening to just look at the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead? It is solid evidence that has convinced millions. We ask, why did God become man? And we must face the issue of man's sin. You see, although we live in a designed world, the world around is full of problems because man has rebelled against this creator. He has sinned. And the creator himself entered human history in order to suffer for sins. He suffered, the just one, for me, the unjust one. Why? That he might bring us to God. Another apostle puts it like this: he has made him, God has made him, Christ, to be sin, the sin offering, for us who knew no sin, that's Jesus, that we might be made the righteousness of God in him. When a person becomes a Christian, two things happen. God takes all their sin and, as it were, places it on Jesus Christ. But the other thing is even more wonderful. God takes all the righteousness of Christ and places it on that believer. Our sins are imputed to Christ, and his righteousness, his goodness is imputed, counted as if it was ours, and we have a perfect standing before a holy God. That's the gospel, and it is marvelous. So let's draw some conclusions here. There are mainly two competing explanations as to how we got here. We used to teach creation in our schools. When I was going to school, that was taught. Evolution was also taught, but there was no anti-creation bias in my day at school. That's completely different today. Now, only evolution by accident is taught as a legitimate theory of origins, and creation is, of course, being excluded as a contrary idea, and that's the situation we find. And yet evolution has serious problems, not demonstrated experimentally. The missing links are still missing. There's no mechanism for major change, and there's no way to get life from dead chemicals. There really isn't. Creation is, by contrast, supported by the evidence. We see design wherever we look, through the telescope and through the microscope. Creation is foundational to the Christian message. The first verse of the Bible opens with God as the creator, and the first verse of the New Testament links in Jesus Christ with the Old Testament, and he himself claims to be that personal revelation of the God of the Old Testament. That is the ultimate proof, actually. When we realize who Jesus is and we come to know him as our Savior, we realize and we know the Creator for ourselves. The fact that he left heaven and came to earth is the ultimate proof for the creation thesis. And the great message of the Bible is, of course, that though we have done sin, each of us, done wrong, we've told lies, we've said wrong things, we've thought wrong things, we are sinners by nature. We can be forgiven because the Creator, our Creator, who made everything in the beginning, came to die for us upon the cross, conquering sin, and to be raised from the grave, conquering death. So the Christian has had his sins forgiven, has had a righteousness of God imputed to him, and has a hope, a certain hope of life everlasting beyond the grave. It's a great thing to be a Christian, and I would commend it to you. There's the empty tomb, and that's a great note on which to finish. The empty tomb of our Lord Jesus Christ, proof that he is the Son of God and the Creator in human form. Thanks for your attention. I'll hand back over to Simon.
Thanks, Steve. That was an excellent presentation, and a few questions, if you're okay.
Yeah, fine. Yeah.
Okay? Someone's asked, do you think creation should be taught in schools under RE, religious education, for those watching outside of the UK, or under science? So should it be taught in schools under RE or under science?
I think it should be taught under both. I think it should be taught under RE, obviously, because it's from the Bible. But I think we should stop looking at the Bible simply as a religious book. You see, it's the Bible should be taught as history, because it's a history book. The Bible can be taught in literature as a poetry book because it's got some of the world's greatest poetry. But when it comes to a book about origins, which is what we're talking about in origin science, then Genesis 1-11 gives us an account of how the universe got here, what's gone wrong, where all the fossils came from, the flood, that year-long flood. Of course, that's why we find soft tissue and radiocarbon in dinosaur bones, because they're simply not that old. And of course, the origin of languages and the different racial groups that we see, ethnic groups, it's all explained in Genesis 1-11. So that should certainly as well inform our science teaching.
And just thinking about that question, would you have a problem with, given what we know about the spiritual condition of fallen human beings, would you have a problem with a non-Christian teaching the Bible?
Well, I think at the end of the day, I don't think so. At the end of the day, that the science teacher he has to answer those big questions. How did we get here? And of course, the evolutionary scenario that we've seen tonight, Big Bang and millions of years and billions of years and life coming by chance and complex organs evolve, it just doesn't fly. So either we don't teach it or we teach what's true. Mm-hmm. And I think that a non-Christian should be able to accept those two propositions. But what we shouldn't do is teach the lie and prohibit everything else. And that's what's on offer in many of our schools today, sadly.
Yeah, we should. Yeah, people should be just teaching what we know from observational science, that life.
I believe so. Yeah.
Life comes from life. Yeah. So you can, but that then leaves the question: should we teach evolution in the RE lesson instead?
I think we should. I think we should. Evolution is an important theory, and I don't know any Christian school anywhere that doesn't teach what evolution is. And that's because it's a fact that it's something everyone, or a lot of people believe in, and therefore everybody needs to be aware what it is, what it says, and its weaknesses. Yeah. And of course, that doesn't mean we teach it as truth. We teach it as what it says, its worldview. And I think it's very legitimate to teach that in RE, certainly, because it is a philosophy, a worldview. And insofar as observations can be explained on a evolutionary scenario, for instance, the peppered moth, we can see varying gene frequencies according to selective pressures in nature that's, I've mentioned that tonight, and it's observable. Let's teach it. But of course, what it doesn't do is explain how moths became moths and how moths are there in the first place, and so on and so forth. We have to teach evolution in its it's very limited truth content, actually.
Yeah, I mean, it's important for us as Christians to know. We may not need to know every aspect of it, but we need to know it enough so we can do what the Apostle Paul tells us in 2 Corinthians 10, to destroy arguments that raise themselves up against the knowledge of the Lord Jesus.
It's interesting as well. You got to ask the question, what do people mean by evolution? Some people mean by evolution change. So, we can now build better rockets than we used to build because we've evolved. Well, the science of building rockets or building planes or building computers may have evolved or improved. So if you use it to just use evolution to mean the word improve, well, we all believe we've got better computers and better rockets and better cars. If you use it to mean the word change, everybody signs up to that. If you use it to mean the word molecules to man, by chance over millions of years, well, this is incredible. It doesn't fly, it doesn't work. And the problem that we find is that people, particularly on the media, I don't know whether they're doing it deliberately, I think some are, they're using evolution to mean one thing in one part of the sentence and then changing it to another thing in the other part of the sentence. And of course, the result is confusion, which is what we get. So that's why I attempted to define the terms. We need to define the terms before we start the discussion. And I'm all for having the discussion.
Yeah. Another point you brought up in the talk was that, and I often come across this argument from evolutionists, is that science will tell us the answer one day. In the future, we'll know how life evolved from non-living chemicals. But isn't there philosophically and scientifically some problems with that? Because one, we do science in the present, you don't do it in the future. You don't reason in the future, you reason now. But even if they did show life could evolve by accident in a lab, the people doing the experiment are intelligent people, so it proves intelligence.
Design. I don't think there's any way out for the evolutionist on this one. You see, the evolutionist often thinks that we're the people of faith and they're the guys who've got the science. And so when someone says, whenever I ask a question, well, how did we get life from dead chemicals? Well, we don't know the answer, but science will tell us in the future. So then I say, well, do you know that's a faith position? And of course, they don't like that because they like to think that they've got the facts and we've got the faith. But actually, on this issue, they're exhibiting a blind faith. It's faith because they haven't got the facts, they don't know the explanation, and it's blind because they can't really see where it's going to come from. So it really is, and of course the evidence that we have that life only comes from life is the experimental position. So the evolutionist who's trying to explain the origin of life by chance is going against the experimental position because of his preconceived commitment to an atheistic worldview. In fact, he's suppressing the evidence because he doesn't like the implication, i.e. that there's a God to whom he must be answerable. Someone's compared it to trying to keep a beach ball underwater in the sea. It's a big ball and you can push it down so far, but eventually it'll pop up. And that's what we find with evolution. You can't suppress the evidence forever. And more people actually around the world, even from a non-Christian perspective, are realizing this, that evolution, as a theory of origins of everything, just doesn't fly. And hopefully it won't be too long before people are willing to abandon that position.
Yeah, I've come across the argument as well from evolutionary apologists that they'll try and argue because of the impossibility of abiogenesis. They'll say, well, evolution isn't about abiogenesis, it's about all the diversity of the species that we see today. I mean, that's quite common for you can see online of a lot of sort of atheistic apologists. How would you answer that one?
Well, I think what they're trying to do there is by separating it, actually, it's a bit disingenuous because they've either got a naturalistic explanation for the whole deal or they haven't.
Mhm.
And I would press them on that and say, well, do you accept then that you haven't got a naturalistic explanation for the origin of life? I'd just push them on that. And they might say something like, well, no, we haven't, but science is going there. So I'd say, well, do you know that's a faith position? I'd make them aware of just what they're saying, if I could, if they would allow me to do so in a nice way, and point out A, that they're in a faith position, and B, that the evidence is contrary to that position. And then actually then we can then talk about, well, we've got all these fossils here. We don't have the missing links. We don't have explanations of mechanisms for organs of extreme complexity. And we've got a pile of fossils. And actually, when you dive into the fossil record, you do not find this tree of life coming out. What you find is catastrophe, fossil graveyards all over the world in sedimentary rock, just like this flood scenario that you find in the Bible. And of course, the dating evidence of the fossils themselves, as opposed to the supposed dates of the rocks, the radiocarbon evidence from the bones confirms a single event time frame for these things. So I think by appealing to the science of the fossils, we can show the evolutionist actually that the creation flood model fits the evidence far better than the millions of years naturalistic evolution model.
Yeah, we've got nothing to fear from evolutionary arguments.
I don't think we've got anything to fear. The problem is we don't get the exposure. And so we do need ministries like Answers in Genesis to be able to just bring before the public these two perspectives. I've listened to many programs on the TV and, praising, looking at the wonders of creation and so on, and praising the evolutionary idea that's supposedly brought it all into being. But so far on the secular channels, I've not heard a scientist, and there are many who are very high-level, highly qualified scientists across the academic spectrum who believe in a creation, fall, flood scenario. Not heard the BBC or any of the major channels present this. Why is that? Let's have the evidence on the table. That's, I think, what we ask for. And for those listening, I urge you to demand the evidence. That's your right as a member of the public to ask for the evidence, to ask for both sides of this question to be aired.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Thanks for your time tonight.
Pleasure. All the best. Bye for now.
And for those watching, as Steve just mentioned there, we don't expose people enough to the truth, and people do need to be exposed to the truth. So I would encourage you to share this talk that Steve has done for us tonight with friends, family members. Go to the AIG web store, equip yourself with resources. Again, I just want to remind people that there's 20% off all our resources at the moment. So it's a great time to equip yourself and get that information out to others, because that's the real problem. We don't often get this message out. We keep it to ourselves, where we need to expose others with it. So once again, thank you.